On Thursday, the 16th of June 2011, just after 7 p.m, a white Citroën van crossed the Talmar Bridge into Cornwall. Inside were two men, both fathers, both tied to organised crime. They were on their way to settle a debt, but they would never return home. 7 years and 2 months later, in August 2018, in a quiet street in North London, police climbed into the loft of a family flat. What they found had been hidden for months, and it told a story of violence, secrecy, and fear. 2 different places, 2 different years, but both would reveal murders that the killers thought could be kept from view. This is the story of the Cornwall farm murders and the killing of Abdi Ali in Enfield, and how both cases expose the darkest corners of Britain's underworld. Welcome to UK Crime Documentaries. Let's get straight into the case. David Griffiths was 35, a father of 3, and once a cage fighter. He had grown up in Plymouth before moving to Bracknell, where he became known for his size and his temper. But outside of the cage, he was deeply involved in the criminal underworld. Griffiths was no street-level dealer. He worked as muscle, an enforcer for men higher up the ladder, trusted to collect debts and keep people in line. His name carried weight, and his presence alone was often enough to send a message. Alongside him was 31-year-old Brett Flournoy. A boxer from the Wirral, he had fought in gyms across Merseyside before turning to pub work and, eventually, to drugs. Flournoy had 2 young children and a partner waiting at home. But like Griffiths, he was more than just a dealer. He was a fixer, a man relied upon to protect the profits of those running Liverpool's lucrative cocaine trade. Both men were described in court as enforcers, linked to an Irish Republican Army-connected gang operating out of Liverpool, a syndicate with reach, money, and the capacity for violence. On the other side were 2 men who had slipped far beyond their depth. Thomas Hay was 26, a former cage fighter like Griffiths, but without the same reputation. He had once been used as a mule. We will talk about him in a few minutes. Now he was broke, unreliable, and on the run from previous offences. And then there was Ross Stone, 28 years old, running Sunny Corner Farm in Cornwall. To neighbours, he was just a farmhand, working heavy machinery on the land. His farm had already become a site for cannabis production. He was in too deep, facing demands he could not meet. It was this mix of hardened enforcers, desperate debtors, and a drug network with no tolerance for excuses that set the stage for what would come next. The debts were heavy and unrelenting. Between Thomas Hay and Ross Stone owed around £40,000 to the men who supplied their drugs. Hay had already made one run to Brazil, smuggling cocaine back to Britain. The gang pushed for him to make another run, but Hay refused. He knew people who had been caught, now serving long terms in South American prisons. He told those close to him that he wasn't going back. Refusing, however, wasn't an option that carried much weight in Liverpool's drug scene. As the days passed and he failed to comply, the pressure grew and the debt only worsened. Ross Stone was trapped just as deeply in debt, and the enforcers were sent to remind him. On the evening of Thursday, the 16th of June 2011, David Griffiths and Brett Flournoy set off on the long drive south. They left Plymouth in a white Citroën Berlingo van with the words "Tile Style" written in brown on both sides. It was a work vehicle, ordinary enough to draw no attention, but for their families it would become a haunting image, the last known sight of the 2 men alive. Just after 7 o'clock, the van crossed the Talmar Bridge into Cornwall. After that, there was pin-drop silence. The men never arrived home, never contacted their partners or children, and never booked into the accommodation they were supposed to. Calls went unanswered, messages were ignored, and within days families reported both missing. Police opened inquiries, but in those first few days there were no clear leads. Both men were fathers. Both had routines that rarely broke without reason. When David Griffiths and Brett Flournoy failed to return home, their families knew something was wrong almost immediately. Days passed with no signs. The men were officially reported missing. Police launched a formal inquiry, tracing their last movements across Devon and into Cornwall. Despite the urgency, the search produced little at first. There were no witnesses placing the men after the Talmar Bridge crossing, and no CCTV that picked them up further along the route. What might have been a simple missing persons case soon turned darker as detectives began to suspect foul play. Behind the scenes, families waited for news, holding out hope that both men might still be alive. The breakthrough came almost by accident. On the 1st of July 2011, officers raided Sunny Corner Farm in an unrelated drugs operation. Beneath the ground, they uncovered a sophisticated cannabis setup, shipping containers buried to hide heat from police surveillance. The farm, they realized, was more than just a quiet corner of Cornwall. It was a hub for crime. Ross Stone was questioned, and under mounting pressure, he cracked. He admitted that Griffiths and Flournoy would not be found alive. He led detectives to the site where he and Hay had hidden the evidence. When police began digging, the grim truth emerged. Buried deep in the soil was something that turned this missing persons case now turned into a double murder investigation. By then, Thomas Hay had fled. He travelled back to Yorkshire, trying to put distance between himself and Cornwall. But the net closed in. Eventually, with nowhere left to run, he handed himself in. Now let's uncover what actually happened at the farm, the moment that revealed the shocking details. When David Griffiths and Brett Flournoy arrived at Sunny Corner on the evening of the 16th of June, the tension was already heavy. Both men had made the journey south with a clear purpose, to collect what was owed and to make sure Ross Stone and Thomas Hay understood that the debt could not be ignored. The two enforcers had a reputation for violence, and this was not a social visit. What followed inside that remote Cornish farm was pieced together later through witness accounts, forensics, and the competing stories told in court. The prosecution argued that Thomas Hay was the gunman. Armed with a 12-bore shotgun, he turned on the men who had come to demand payment. Brett Flournoy was shot in the back. David Griffiths took a blast to the shoulder and face. The killings were sudden, brutal, and final. Ross Stone, by his own account, claimed he had not been present when the fatal shots were fired. He said that when he returned, both Griffiths and Flournoy were already dead, lying on the ground. He told the jury that Hay looked disheveled and panicked, repeating the chilling words, "Dave just wouldn't die." Hay denied this version completely. In his story, Griffiths had attacked him, and he had fled the scene after being beaten, leaving the two men alive. He maintained he had no hand in their deaths, pushing the blame back onto Stone. For the jury, two conflicting accounts were laid out, each man shifting the blame onto the other, neither accepting responsibility for the killings. But what was beyond dispute was that two enforcers sent to collect the drug debt had been shot dead at Sunny Corner Farm. However the killings had unfolded, what followed was a deliberate attempt to erase all trace of what had happened that night. The bodies of David Griffiths and Brett Flournoy were dragged to the Citroën Berlingo van. The same vehicle that carried them across the Talmar Bridge now became their coffin. Their remains were stuffed inside, alongside the possessions they had brought with them. To make sure nothing could be identified, the van was set alight. Flames gutted the interior, charring the bodies beyond recognition. It was a crude form of cremation, carried out in the dark, hidden by the farm's isolation. But burning alone was not enough. The van, now blackened and still carrying the victims inside, was driven to a pit on the property. With his own machinery, Ross Stone lowered the van into the ground and covered it with soil, turning the farm into a hidden grave. Blood had stained the lane near the farmhouse. To hide it, cement powder was thrown over the ground, a desperate effort to erase the violence. The shotgun believed to have been used was dumped, lost to the investigation. Other evidence was scattered or destroyed too. From the perspective of those at the farm, it was a job done. Two men silenced, their vehicle and their bodies hidden in the earth. For weeks the site carried on in silence. To neighbours, Sunny Corner looked unchanged. To the families of Griffiths and Flournoy, There was only absence, phone calls unanswered, and a growing fear that something dreadful had happened. For 6 long weeks, the families of David Griffiths and Brett Flournoy lived in a state of limbo. Both men had vanished without trace, and each passing day deepened the fear that something irreversible had happened. Loved ones made appeals, clung to rumors, and checked every lead, desperate for any sign of life. The silence became unbearable. Every knock at the door, every late-night phone call carried the possibility of news. But none came. When police finally unearthed the burnt-out van at Sunny Corner Farm, that fragile hope was shattered. The discovery of human remains confirmed what the families had feared but struggled to accept. Outside court, relatives spoke of the agony they had endured. For Janet Griffiths, David's mother, the loss of her son was described as a living hell. She recalled the sleepless nights, the weeks spent wondering if he might still walk back through the door, only to learn that his body had been burned and buried like refuse. Brett Flournoy's family spoke in similar terms, describing the devastation of losing a son, a partner, and a father of 2 young children in such a brutal way. Both families were forced to come to terms not only with the murders themselves, but with the manner in which the men's bodies had been treated. It was not just death they were mourning, but the denial of dignity, the stripping away of even a proper farewell. By early 2012, the case of David Griffiths and Brett Flournoy reached its conclusion in the austere courtroom of Truro Crown Court. For weeks, jurors heard competing accounts of what had happened at Sunny Corner Farm. What we have already covered is that neither prepared to shoulder responsibility for the killings, but the overwhelming evidence makes it easy to understand. After just 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. In passing sentence, Mr. Justice Mackay addressed the courtroom with words that cut to the heart of the case. These were bad men, but they had the right not to be killed. Trading in drugs does not carry the death penalty. It was a stark reminder that, despite their roles in organized crime, Griffiths and Flournoy were still entitled to life and justice. Thomas Hay was found guilty of 2 counts of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 35 years before parole could even be considered. Ross Stone, meanwhile, was acquitted of murder but jailed for 5 years for obstructing a coroner by burning and burying the bodies. Hay would later appeal his conviction, insisting that Stone had played a greater role than admitted. But his appeals were dismissed, the court finding no reason to disturb the verdict. For the families of the victims, justice had been served, though the pain of loss endured. In the winter of 2017, Abdi Ali was just 17 years old. Born in Somalia, he had grown up in North London, described by teachers and neighbors as a happy and respectful teenager. To his family, he was quiet, polite, and full of potential. But away from home, Abdi had drifted into a different world. By the end of that year, he was moving in circles linked to the Get Money Gang, a North London crew known for dealing heroin and crack cocaine. Abdi was young, but to gangs like this, that made him useful. Teenagers were often exploited, drawn into roles where they carried the risks while others reaped the profits. One of the most common methods was known as cuckooing, dealers setting up inside the homes of vulnerable addicts, using their flats as a base for drug supply. It meant avoiding the streets, avoiding police attention, and transferring the danger to people who were already desperate or dependent. In December, Abdi was placed inside a small flat in Enfield, North London. It was the home of Gary Hopkins. We will talk about him and his partner in a few minutes. For them, letting gang members operate from their home was as much about survival as choice. For Abdi, the move into Hopkins's flat was just another step in the machinery of county line supply. He was far from the classroom, far from family oversight, and locked into an environment where violence was never far away. In a world where young men were treated as disposable assets, his fate was already being written inside those 4 walls. At the center of Abdi Ali's story were the 2 people whose home became his final resting place. Gary Hopkins and Stacey Doherty. Hopkins, then 37, was a father of three, known locally by the nickname The Magician. It wasn't a name drawn from the underworld, but from his habit of showing off party tricks, sleight of hand and illusions that amused friends and neighbors. But behind that harmless nickname lay a far darker reality. Hopkins had a history of violence and a criminal record that stretched back years. At just 21, he was convicted of causing death by dangerous driving and aggravated vehicle taking. It was the start of a chaotic cycle of brushes with the law that never really ended. Living with him in their small Enfield flat was 28-year-old Stacey Doherty, the mother of his children. Like Hopkins, she struggled with long-term addiction to heroin and crack cocaine. Both were caught in the grip of dependency, with money short, debts piling up, and chaos defining their daily lives. Their flat was already a place of instability before gangs moved in, but once dealers began using it as a base, the risks escalated. Abdi Ali's presence in their home only heightened the tension. Hopkins and Doherty later claimed they had no real choice in the matter, that gangs like the Get Money Gang gave instructions, not invitations. And with the fear of reprisals hanging over them, resistance seemed impossible. But day to day, the arrangement was far from smooth. Arguments broke out over money, over drugs, and over Abdi's refusal to leave when told. The tension inside the Enfield flat reached its breaking point on December 21st, 2017. By then, Gary Hopkins was under immense pressure. Christmas was days away, money was scarce, and debts hung over his head like a constant shadow. Abdi Ali's presence in the home had become another source of conflict. When Hopkins demanded that Abdi leave, the teenager refused, almost certainly, as the court later heard, because he feared the consequences from the gang he worked for. What happened next was brutal and sudden. Hopkins snapped. He armed himself with a claw hammer and struck Abdi hard across the head. The first blow was not enough. Seizing a 16-centimeter kitchen knife, he stabbed the 17-year-old again and again, inflicting devastating injuries to his chest. After the killing, Hopkins rifled through Abdi's belongings. He found around £400, money intended for drug sales, and took it. Later, prosecutors argued that this cash was used to give his own family a good Christmas, buying gifts and covering expenses as though the violence upstairs had never happened. But Hopkins was left with a body in the flat, with 3 children asleep in the next room. His response was as calculated as it was callous. Abdi's body was wrapped tightly in a duvet cover. Hopkins tied plastic bags over Abdi's head and used electrical cables to make a noose so he could lift the teenager into the loft. Together, Hopkins and Stacey Doherty dragged the body into the loft space above their flat. Alongside Abdi, they placed the very weapons used in the attack, the hammer, the knife, as though the attic could swallow both the crime and its evidence. For 8 long months, the body of Abdi Ali lay hidden just a few feet above the family's heads. In the days after Abdi Ali vanished, his family's concern grew quickly. Only hours before, he had been celebrating his sister's wedding. When he failed to return home, his family knew something was wrong. They reported him missing, and police began tracing his movements. For his loved ones, the following weeks were a nightmare. They made appeals, spoke to the press, and searched tirelessly for answers. His sister later described the wait as torture, a daily cycle of hope and despair, not knowing whether Abdi was alive or dead. But the investigation stalled. Leads went nowhere, and there was no sign of the teenager on CCTV or in hospital records. For 8 months, his family lived in uncertainty. Meanwhile, Gary Hopkins and Stacey Doherty were trying to carry on with their lives. After the killing, they even left London for a time, taking their children to Herefordshire to lay low. Back in Enfield, Abdi's body remained in the loft, slowly decomposing. Insects infested the remains, and the flat itself carried the silence of a crime, hidden just above the ceiling. The secret might have stayed hidden even longer, but Hopkins could not keep his mouth shut. He began to boast to friends, bragging about what he had done. In one conversation he said, "I've done it before, he's in the loft." On at least one occasion, Hopkins even encouraged people to climb up and see for themselves. Some thought he was joking, others too afraid to check. But when one of Stacy's friends visited the flat in the summer of 2018, she saw enough to convince her the story was true. Soon after, she went to the police. In August 2018, officers searched the property. Pushing open the loft hatch, they found grim evidence. Abdi Ali's body was still wrapped in a black and red duvet, plastic bags tied around his head. The hammer, the knife and cables used in the killing were there too. The remains were badly decomposed, yet they told a clear story of violence. For Abdi's family, the discovery confirmed their worst fears. His body had been hidden less than a mile from home, while they spent 8 months praying for his safe return. The truth was more brutal than they could ever have imagined. By March 2019, the case of Abdi Ali finally reached the Old Bailey. For weeks, the court heard arguments over what had happened inside the small Enfield flat. Hopkins, desperate to deflect responsibility, pointed the finger at a senior figure in the Get Money gang named Gail Bowler. He claimed Bowler had been behind the killing, insisting he had only hidden the body in fear of retribution. But the jury saw through his shifting story. The prosecution laid out the evidence with clarity. It was Hopkins who struck Abdi and all the aftermath. After 16 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Hopkins was guilty of murder. When the sentence was passed, the courtroom fell silent. For Abdi's family, the outcome brought some measure of justice, but it could not undo the agony of the months before. They spoke of the torturous wait to learn the truth, the nights spent searching and praying for a safe return, only to be told that their son's body had been lying less than a mile from home all along. They were denied the chance to bury him with dignity, and that absence of closure left a wound that no sentence could ever heal. Hopkins was jailed for life, with a minimum term of 22 years before parole could even be considered. His partner, Stacey Doherty, was acquitted of murder. Yet her role in concealing the crime could not be ignored. She was later sentenced to 27 months for perverting the course of justice. What do you think about the cases and the sentences? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take. And if you found this breakdown informative, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode of UK Crime Documentaries.